Hello, my fellow Victorians. Now that the state of emergency in Victoria is coming to an end on December 15th, I thought this would be a good time to go back and look at why we were inflicted with many of the restrictions and bans during the COVID pandemic. The government says these restrictions were put in place because of medical considerations, but that is far from the truth. Many of the restrictions placed on Victorians were motivated simply by politics. Not all, but many of them were. Let's take a look at those we know were motivated by politics and those that were most likely influenced by political considerations. We need to remember Daniel Andrews is a known and proven liar. This has been proven by the comments he made about the offer by the Commonwealth Government of ADF troops to assist with the quarantine hotels in Victoria. Daniel Andrews was caught lying by his own press releases and the statements he made in front of television cameras. We should never take what he says on face value. So what restrictions were politically motivated? First, from what I can find out, the 9 p.m. curfews were not supported by the police or medical advice. They were entirely the creation of Daniel Andrews. The question is, why put a curfew in place when it is not needed for medical reasons? Only Daniel Andrews can answer that. Next, some recent protests have seen the protesters dispersed by police. The reason given is that they might be spreading the virus. However, on the day prior to one protest, in the exact same location, there were many more people much closer together having picnics and enjoying themselves, and the police did absolutely nothing. Only when protesters arrived did the police move in to heavy-handedly break up the protest. One protest by nurses was broken up by the police even though all the nurses had been fully vaccinated, they were wearing face masks and were socially distancing. I think what Daniel Andrews really does not like is people who think differently to himself or who disagree with him. Andrews and his police do not like people disagreeing with them, so they broke up these protests. The odd thing is that I've seen protests against racism held in Bell Street during the pandemic. The police were present then protecting the protesters, and the police did the exact same thing protecting protesters at the Black Lives Matter protest in early 2020. Which protests the Andrews police forced break up and those they allowed to continue seem to be determined solely by Daniel Andrews' politics and ideology. Next, consider who did and who did not work during the pandemic. Government staff were working, in fact they got a pay rise. Council workers were at work, and who are these people? Well, one thing that can be said about them is that a lot of them make up the ALP voter base. And who did not work? Retail workers, restaurant workers, to name a few. Who else? Churches and synagogues remain closed. Why is that? The answer could be that these people generally are not ALP supporters. Next, consider the claim that only essential services were allowed to operate. But it comes down to what you think is an essential service. For example, to the Andrews government, roof painters are an essential service. That's right, roof painters, not roof repairers, roof painters. Painting a perfectly watertight roof is an essential service to Daniel Andrews. Why is that? Well, again, a lot of these tradesmen would be ALP supporters. I know this because I had my roof painted during the height of the pandemic in 2020 and spoke to the people involved. Also, installing air conditioners during winter is an essential service. I've seen air conditioners installed in the past few months. Now, why would this be an essential service? Again, a lot of these tradesmen would be ALP supporters. So why this careful selection of who can and who cannot work? Well, Daniel Andrews happens to be a Marxist. Yes, a full-blown extremist and fanatical Marxist. And many of his decisions make perfect sense if you take that into account. He despises and ridicules religion, and he loathes people who don't vote for him, or who disagree with him, or who see things differently. In fact, part of Daniel Andrews' own supporter base, members of the CFMEU, were called neo-Nazis, simply because they dared to disagree and oppose him. Please see video 3 in the description below. I think it should be clear that Daniel Andrews is a tyrant. He's like Xi Jinping of China, who wants people to carefully study his thoughts, so they do as they're told and agree with him. Next, let's look at the quarantine hotel disaster run by Daniel Andrews and his worthless nincompoopocracy. At the very start of the pandemic, back in early 2020, Daniel Andrews started to quarantine people who had COVID or may have had COVID. A 14-day quarantine in a quarantine hotel was mandatory if you returned from overseas, were in contact with someone who had COVID, or contracted COVID yourself. But this was not the case if you were part of the ALP supporter base. Workers from Cedar Meats in Melbourne were the first COVID-19 mega cluster in Victoria, and for Cedar Meat workers the quarantine was entirely optional. For everyone else it was mandatory, but not for these trade union workers, even though it was clear many of them had COVID-19. Brett Sutton's deputy issued a directive to the security contractors at the quarantine hotels, telling them to let Cedar Meat workers come and go as they please from the quarantine hotels. That's right, Cedar Meat workers could leave whenever they liked, meet whoever they liked, and spread the virus to anyone they came in contact with. Why did this happen? Was it just the utter stupidity of Brett Sutton's deputy? Possibly, but the Cedar Meat trade unionists form a part of the ALP supporter base. Completely mad, isn't it? You wonder how anyone could be that stupid and negligent. And how do we know all this? Well, it was because one news outlet actually did the hard yards and interviewed security guards just after the Coate Inquiry. You can see the video where all this information was provided. Please see video 4 in the description below. Next, let's consider the 800 plus deaths that occurred in our aged care homes. The Coate Inquiry traced the virus that killed over 800 elderly people in our retirement homes directly back to lapses in the quarantine hotels. Only they were not lapses. Daniel Andrews would like to describe them as lapses because that would put the blame onto someone else. What actually caused the spread of the virus into the community were directives coming from either Daniel Andrews or Brett Sutton's department, and ultimately most likely from Daniel Andrews himself. It was the decisions of Andrews and Sutton's departments that let the COVID-19 virus escape into the community and cause the deaths of over 800 elderly people in our aged care homes. It was not a lapse or an accident. It was a deliberate directive from the state government. Daniel Andrews issued or had someone issue directives, and these things happened. Anyone with any sense would have realised that allowing trade unionists known to be infected with COVID to come and go as they pleased was utter madness and asking for a disaster to happen. Daniel Andrews and Brett Sutton are guilty of manslaughter. Both have blood on their hands. Their attempts at political favouritism let the virus escape and kill over 800 elderly people in our aged care homes. But they don't care, and they continue with their charade in front of the news cameras, misleading and fooling people, knowing that they'll never be called to account either by the media or by WorkSafe, who are responsible for investigating these deaths. Next, let's consider WorkSafe Victoria and their refusal to apply the law to Daniel Andrews, Brett Sutton and other people in the Victorian government who deliberately allowed the virus to escape from the quarantine hotels and kill over 800 elderly Victorians. You see, Daniel Andrews has his ALP buddy running WorkSafe Victoria. WorkSafe Victoria has done everything they can to ensure no charges will ever be laid against Daniel Andrews or Brett Sutton. They first tried to go so slow on the investigation that the 2-year limit on prosecution would expire. When that failed, they refused to hand across their paperwork to the Office of Public Prosecutions. It was a private law firm and a private organisation who did the hard work examining the reports of the Coate Inquiry to demonstrate to the OPP that laws had been broken by the Andrews government. However, if a private organisation was responsible for those 800 deaths, WorkSafe would quickly charge the directors of those companies with manslaughter. But that will never happen to Daniel Andrews or Brett Sutton. And WorkSafe Victoria still continues to protect Daniel Andrews. After being forced to investigate the deaths of these 800 elderly people, WorkSafe now will not charge any individuals. Only government departments will be charged. This means the department and not individuals are at fault. Daniel Andrews, Brett Sutton and the other people who should be charged with manslaughter again escape charges and likely prosecution. The only people who will benefit from all this are the lawyers. All this is the scheming and plotting of Daniel Andrews, Brett Sutton and other people in the ALP. Andrews and Sutton should be charged with manslaughter and imprisoned. But Daniel Andrews knows this won't happen. He has his protectors in the media, the police, government departments, and legal areas of government that ran the Coate Inquiry, and also in WorkSafe Victoria. What this amounts to is simple. The Victorian government is now really nothing but a criminal organisation that can break their own laws and get away scot-free. I've collected the videos in the description below that document the criminal actions that have gone on in WorkSafe Victoria to protect Daniel Andrews. This is what happens when you have a Marxist running the state. As you can see, politics has driven and influenced many decisions of Daniel Andrews during the COVID pandemic. Many such decisions have been disastrous to Victoria and to many Victorian families. But Daniel Andrews uses his government connections and friends to escape prosecution and put up a smokescreen of deceptive and utterly dishonest government investigations. One final thing I must mention. To those courageous people who go out and protest against Daniel Andrews' lockdowns and his other directives, please do not put yourself in harm's way. Daniel Andrews has his thugs in the police force and his liars in the media to protect him. He has no intention of listening to you or calling off his police force. As many of you already know, many in the Victorian police are criminals. For example, they invented false charges against people. They withheld important information in the courts, that is, they didn't tell the whole truth, and they look for ways to arrest people who were doing nothing wrong. They pretend to enforce the law, but they themselves are criminals who do not care about obeying the law. Keep yourself safe. Don't do anything stupid to get yourself into trouble. What we need to do, if possible, is vote these gangsters and criminals and deceivers out of office. Thank you for your time and stay safe.